Just a word on country program evaluations at the World Bank. Unlike our completion learning reviews, which look at a single country strategy and all the targets that are set out at the beginning and how it's achieved at the end, the country program evaluation is a much longer time frame. It's usually about a 10-year time frame. We do relatively few of them because they're fairly resource intensive. Up till now, we've done about 2 or 3 a year. Going forward, we'll be doing about 4 a year. There's an increased interest from our board and the Committee on Development Effectiveness for more countrywide evaluations. One of the benefits of doing the 10-year period is not only can we assess progress relative to targets and objectives, but we can look at the evolution of the engagement. And so a big part of the exercise is how the bank group has responded to changing circumstances, how it's learned from experience, how it's adapted to changes in government and government priorities, which is a really important dimension of the country program evaluation. Beyond that, and we also are now much more deliberate in ensuring that they're prepared, in fact, so that they're actually ready before they start work on the next country partnership framework. Our sense is, once staff start to commit things to paper, they start owning what they've got, and in order to maximize the impact, we now choose countries for which the next country partner framework is 18 months to 2 years in the future. That gives us about 9 months to prepare the CPE, by which time they're just starting to prepare the country partnership framework, and hopefully we can maximize IEG's impact that way. And with that, let me turn this over to Kostya to share the findings.
Thank you very much, and it's good to be back in ADB among so many friends and former colleagues. We are very happy to present to you our evaluation. This is obviously an evaluation of the World Bank Group, but it's also World Bank Group program is placed within a country, so it's very relevant for your work as well, especially for those who work on the Philippines program. And Jeff briefly touched upon what is the main purpose and the focus of the CPEs, and why did we choose Philippines? As noted, we do 4 or 5 per year. Philippines was last evaluated in '99, about 20 years ago. It's a large economy, important for the World Bank and the development community in general. It's a country that is about to make a transition from lower middle income status to upper middle income status the next couple of years, if everything goes as predicted. And of course, it's a large program which lends itself to quite a rich evaluation. It has plenty of lending, all kinds of dialogue modalities, and analytical work. Very quickly on recent developments, of course, you all know that, you live here. Philippines wasn't affected as much as many other countries by the global crisis because of strong domestic consumption, remittances. Country has been growing recently at higher rates than the previous decade. The macroeconomy and financial sector are quite stable, and country has very high credit ratings given by all major credit rating agencies. And it's soon to become, in a couple of years, an upper middle income country, which is a big transition. And just another snapshot on gender equality, for example, it actually ranks quite high in the world, which is kind of defeats the general perception of lower middle income countries or non-high income countries being not faring well, which is not true in case of Philippines. However, there are many issues left, and we all know them. The poverty rate remains high. There is very high levels of inequality, and general human development indicators are all sort of lingering in the second 113th. If you look at the poverty performance and inequality, compare them with some upper middle income countries, the region, you can see it's quite flat compared to others. It doesn't decrease much over time. And of course, we all know that there are many frequent natural disasters which affects the economy, life of people. And there is the simmering conflict in the south of the country on the island of Mindanao. So first we try to group the challenges and then try to structure the evaluation around them, right? So there's 3 big blocks, and infrastructure gaps, Philippines is quite behind most of its regional high-performing economies, issues on governance and business climate, and of course major unfinished agenda on decentralization. Just to highlight a couple of points before moving on. So Philippines will be on its way to become an upper middle income country. How does it compare to a typical World Bank program in an upper middle income country? If you can see, for example, there's a huge disparity, right? In a typical middle income country, you have many projects in infrastructure, transport, energy mainly, very few in the Philippine program, and there are lots of activities directed on poverty reduction, which is not the case in a typical upper middle income country, of course. This is the evolution of the World Bank strategy, different two administrations that are covered by this report. There was a lot of attention to governance in the first strategy under Aquino administration, and sort of things changed more towards public investment, infrastructure, job creation under Duterte administration. And Mindanao, quite importantly, was a very important theme in both of these national development plans. A quick snapshot of the World Bank portfolio activities. You have a lot of analytics, quite outstanding for a middle income country in general. And our colleagues in the bank also use a lot of trust funding to conduct them. So there were, if you look at this, the program within the two strategy cycles, one can conclude that there are these four ongoing, what we called in the evaluation development platforms, a series of similar projects addressing similar issues. And we group them around these four topics. One would be the DPL series, which covered governance, investment climate, natural disaster risk management. The series of rural development projects, starting from Mindanao regional project, which was scaled up to national level. The Philippines Rural Development Program is the most famous one, very large program. And a series of social welfare and development reform projects, which supported the National Conditional Cash Transfer Program. And last, the series of CDD, community-driven development projects, the Kalahi projects. If you group the projects by the global practices, the bank, the sector, so to speak, again, kind of a couple of highlights on the comparison with a UMIC program, typical UMIC program, and Philippines. A lot more happening on agriculture, for example, and a lot more happening on social, urban, rural development areas compared to a typical UMIC. And some quick comparisons with other upper middle income countries. In the evaluation, we have these four areas, four pillars or strategic engagement areas. First one, what we call macroeconomic management and governance. It's divided into four areas on tax collection, macro management, procurement, and public spending. So what we did throughout the report, we looked at each area, the country level outcomes, and then looked at the World Bank Group contribution. Because in this case, in general, a country like Philippines, the size of the economy and the abundance of all kinds of financing sources, talking about direct attribution is very difficult, if at all possible. So we talk about contribution, kind of mapping what was done at the country level and what did the World Bank contribute to. And quite interestingly, if you look at the focus of the program on macro and governance, it was the central theme of the World Bank engagement, especially under Aquino administration. And the World Bank spent lots of resources, human resources, other resources, trust funds and all, on trying to push this agenda through all of its lending. And when we interviewed the colleagues who worked there at that time in the Philippines, we heard a lot of frustration in the way that things were happening, but not much progress was being seen. However, now, if you look back and you compare on several indicators, actually you can see a lot of progress happened over time, which kind of shows that this kind of persistence, although through frustrations, paid off at the end. There was the macroeconomic performance, I already mentioned, is quite positive. The tax to GDP improved drastically, several percentage points, 16, which is quite decent. Country has investment grade sovereign credit rating accorded by all three main credit agencies. The SOEs really improved their performance, and the World Bank contributed in all of these areas. So some of the interesting areas, for example, were the introduction of the sin tax law on alcohol and tobacco, which was then just not an easy sell politically, but it was connected to the health reform. So the proceeds from these taxes were invested into the health sector, which was the way to sell it at that time, which worked quite well. Again, on the expenditure rationalization, it's always quite often a challenge when countries start performing better, gets more revenues. There's a risk of money being squandered, spent in all kinds of inefficient areas. In this case, in the Philippines, you can see expansion of public spending in a lot of pro-poor areas, better budget planning. There was a serious issue of rice subsidies, which was addressed by the government with the help of the bank. And over time, although it wasn't easy, but public procurement practices also improved, and it reflected in the ratings accorded by the World Bank's procurement reviews. In this area, what we call transparency, accountability in the public sector, we looked at a variety of sub-areas: public expenditure, kind of general interaction with civil society. One of the areas where we felt that more could have been done was introduction of modern integrated financial management systems, which is usually an important addition to the system in a middle-income country as large as the Philippines, as spread out as Philippines. And surprisingly, the country doesn't have it yet. There's some kind of homegrown, simple system, but there's a lot of space for more work in this area. In one of the recent updates of the program, 2017, the governance work in this particular area was scaled down significantly. And the justification in the program documents was that there's less demand from government side, which we couldn't confirm talking to the government. So we felt there is also space here to scale up going forward, building on the solid foundations already existing. The area of decentralization and subnational government, local government strengthening was probably the most problematic, although it's hard to blame the World Bank for that. The country system is set up in a way that it's really difficult to reach out to the local level, subnational level, provincial level. The units are too many. They don't have much autonomy. The system is very centralized, and many attempts of the World Bank to kind of establish working relationships and reach out were by and large not successful. However, one of the projects, an ongoing rural development project, we found that it has created, perhaps inadvertently, the focus of the project was rural development and farm-to-market roads, not local governments. But while doing that, they created a platform where the local governments, business community, private sector, the civil society would come together to make decisions on public investment, which was kind of an alternative to the traditional system of governance at the local level. And it was much more transparent, much more effective compared to the old system. Now, of course, the question is, how sustainable will it be going forward? But this is something we can build on moving ahead. The other area, which we called private sector-led economic growth, we look at investment climate, access to finance, the whole agriculture sector, and infrastructure finance, including PPPs. On investment climate, progress was quite limited. If you look at the country performance also on all kinds of indices, rankings, hasn't improved much. Some cases even deteriorated. Many national level indicators on doing business and others, and even the enterprise surveys show really stagnantly poor performance. Access to finance, where the bank's private sector arm, IFC, was mainly involved. Also, there's not much to show off, and that's especially problematic in the agriculture sector, and most of the poor do not have access to the formal financial sector. There were some small success stories here and there. A couple of banks that IFC worked with increased their lending to SMEs, but that was very small on the national level. On agriculture, this is driven mainly by one large project and some preceding projects. The project is still ongoing, it's not closed, and government requested extension from the World Bank. It's considered to be a success, and indeed, we did a lot of work visiting sites, talking to counterparts at all levels, and there are some very impressive results on increasing productivity, household incomes, access to markets, and so on. Most of these project finances small-scale rural infrastructure, but there's also an important component on building up rural entrepreneurship, which we found by and large successful. However, there's a clear area of better synergies with IFC, and more could have been done. There was a concurrent IFC program on financial literacy, with which this program wasn't cooperating at all. So there are some possible synergies that could have been further strengthened. On infrastructure finance, again, the World Bank has not been involved much in this sector overall. It was more about management of infrastructure through PPPs. And again, PPP is just one way of managing, right? So in the beginning of the period, there was a lot of interest from the government, which kind of was scaled down. And at the end, most of the transactions that were planned by IFC, most of them were either canceled or not operational. There's only one so far, the airport expressway, which is operational. This area, which we call this services, better services for the poor, poverty measurement and social protection, there was a series of projects supporting National Conditional Cash Transfer Program. And IEG, we did a simultaneous evaluation of this program while doing the country program evaluation. And at the end, this was considered one of the best practices by the World Bank globally. And it got accorded the highest rating, highly satisfactory rating for the project. Lots of positive results, and the cash transfers, not only, obviously they contribute to people's income, people are given cash, right? But there was a clear change in behavior on health. It led to better outcomes on health and education. The projects, the CDD projects, nationwide, and PRDP also, the Rural Development Project, they looked at they addressed service delivery in municipalities, which was generally positive. However, the evaluation report found that there could be issues going forward with sustainability of many structures put in place, institutions, and this is basically, in a way, many repeater projects at the community level, which at some point also posed some risk for local governments' parallel structures of governance. This is something to be concerned about going forward. And on health and education, which is this human capital development sub-area, the engagement of the World Bank was quite limited. There was a lot of analytical work, one or two projects, which were also evaluated earlier by IEG. And in terms of results, the country is ranking quite high in terms of access, but the higher you go up the ladder of education, you see decreasing quality of education. So this is a typical transition problem from low middle income to higher upper middle income. Right? You need the access is not a problem anymore. It's more about delivering quality and skills agenda. The resilience sub-area, which is quite diverse. We have three distinct areas: disaster risk management, climate change, and FCV, fragility, conflict, and violence, which is mainly conflict in the south, the Muslim Mindanao area. Disaster risk management, again, is probably one of the good practice areas. The Philippine government and the World Bank cooperated quite productively in employing all kinds of innovative mechanisms. Insurance schemes, guarantees, there was a catastrophe deferred drawdown option, DPLs, used by the government, all kinds of plans put in place before the catastrophe could hit. A quite comprehensive flood management plan for Manila, which was a very complex program, was developed for Metro Manila. At the same time, there are some areas like sewage, solid waste, where a lot of expectations but few results to report. And the sheer scale of the program is such that the smaller efforts that were spent on addressing them were not effective really at the end. And another problem was, of course, low implementation capacity at the local level. We looked at the climate change agenda, at adaptation and mitigation, kind of both. And clearly on adaptation, country fared better than on mitigation. It still remains dedicated to all the international commitments, and the bank and IFC had quite a diverse program on mitigation, but again, similar to some aspects of the DRM program, the scale of the problem is such that it's really hard to address this to the scale of effort spent and financing there. So a lot of cooperation was basically on the analytics, not that much on financing. And just a quick look at the emission energy intensity of the economy. You can see that the emissions go up, and it's a very coal-dependent economy, and so far there are not many visible structural changes to address it. And last but not least, on peace and reconciliation in Mindanao. Again, the World Bank has played quite a unique role there in our view. It has been involved throughout the different stages of conflict for several decades, and was able to establish close partnership relationship with different parties to the conflict, especially the former rebel group, the MILF. And the World Bank helped to establish the Bangsamoro Development Agency, the development arm of the MILF, helped to build capacity, was an effective manager of the large multi-donor trust fund there. And there are a lot of community-level activities happening which kind of try to bring the communities together and facilitate peace and reconciliation. So generally, this was quite one of the positive, again, one of the best practice examples which can be shared by the Philippines with the rest of the world. So to conclude, overall, we felt that the glass is half full, and country achieved a lot of positive results in the last decade, and the World Bank was a sort of able contributor to that. However, the growth and proximity to this threshold of UMIC has not resolved many outstanding problems. Although the challenge today is not that much answering the what question, but how. So the constraints are well known, but how to address them is something that the World Bank Group management and the Philippine government have to decide together on moving forward. Yes. Overall, there was a feeling that the World Bank is one of the many development partners in the Philippines. Country is blessed with presence of many. There are multilaterals, bilaterals here, providing all kinds of assistance, and bank is part of the group. And it still does have competitive advantages, which can play to its strengths, and doesn't have to be necessarily in the area of infrastructure where not much lending is happening today. At the same time, to do so, first of all, within our recommendations, we felt that all these long-running, generally successful programs, the DPL, the CCT, rural development, has to be looked at and upgraded, because there is a risk of staying in the comfort zone too long. And the longer you stay doing the same thing over and over, the less value you have and the less you put on the table for the government going forward. So what is the strategy for graduation from CCT? What is the strategy for moving from CDD projects to institutionalizing them into local governance? So those are the questions that we felt that the government and the World Bank need to address moving to the next stage. The future in many countries, such as the Philippines, large countries, is the subnational decentralized engagement. And it has been a real challenge in the country for the World Bank. And we felt that it is a challenge for the reasons not dependent on the World Bank. But we do have some examples of successful engagement. PRDP is one of them. Engagement through with the Department of Agriculture, so its network of agencies in provinces, played out really well. So perhaps it's difficult to replicate it, but it's a model which is there, and there is a platform that can be institutionalized for better public investment management, for building up capacity and entrepreneurship at the local level. The World Bank produced many analytical reports, and we did our own separate assessment, which was the part of this evaluation of the quality and relevance of these reports. So they ranked quite high on the quality side. However, there was a perception that there's much more appetite within government for the shorter, quicker, just-in-time reports, analytical assistance, technical assistance geared towards implementation support. Again, something to consider for the World Bank management moving forward. Engagement in Mindanao, in BARM, was one of the focal areas throughout this whole period, and a clear area for relative success for the bank. And we felt that the bank can build on it and maybe even look at Mindanao as a geographic area of focal engagement going forward. And last but not least, there's a lot to be done to improve the cooperation between the World Bank and IFC. There are all kinds of disjointed activities that we felt could be synergized, and there are many ways of doing that. We've seen joint task leadership, joint strategy development, and so on. This whole problem of the missing middle in the Philippines, the missing middle in terms of the private sector, the size of the enterprises, the missing middle in terms of huge income disparity can be addressed through that, directly and indirectly, sort of helping, working together to build up the small and medium-sized enterprises to fill the gap and raise the income and diversify the economy. So this is the evaluation in a nutshell. I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments you have. Thank you.
Well, again, like Marvin, I would like to congratulate you on an interesting, well-written report. Thanks for coming out here again as part of your outreach and dissemination. So my comments are more from an evaluator's perspective. I cannot claim to be an expert on the Philippines as such. But I just want to remind you also about ADB's system of country program evaluations. So yeah, we similarly do, let's say, nowadays only one evaluation a year. I understand you're going to ramp that up. We were doing it for 40, in the context of 40 countries, and you were doing it probably for 150. So that raises the question: how useful was it in the past? What you guys were doing? If it's, and the last evaluation was done in 1999 or something. So that's quite a long time. But I would like to remind the audience also here that both World Bank and ADB have a system whereby the operations write a final review or some completion report, or as in your case, this learning report every 4 or 5 years, which is then validated by independent evaluator. So we are doing that, and so there's an independent evaluation report on all country operations, let's say every 4 or 5 years. So that's, I think, pretty systematic. Also, if you compare it to bilaterals and maybe other MDBs. Just something about our past. I looked back, and IED did 2 country program evaluations before. One in 2003. Pretty soon after we started this whole exercise of country program evaluations, and one in 2008. I don't know why there was short time in between. So 2008 was our last one. We're now in 2020, and moving forward we haven't planned one. So that's also giving us a pause to think. But again, we're doing these validations also pretty comprehensively, actually. There's a lot of there's a lot of work in evaluation on country programs overall. I looked back at these past evaluations from the IED side, and I noticed also some differences but also similarities in the findings of these evaluations between now and in the past, and also with the IEG report. So, for instance, I looked at the 2008 CAPE report, and I'm just going to read out what we found at that stage, and you can see the similarities and differences, which also gives you a view of. There's a lot that changes in a country like the Philippines, but there's also a lot that stays the same for a very long time. So, for instance, in 2008, we wrote, the ADB assistance program over the past 5 years has been successful in meeting its more selective objectives, despite the need for improvements. However, the larger context for the next country strategy continues to be daunting. Poverty is high, progress towards MDGs is slow, lagging in key areas, and government expenditures for related social and economic services are still low compared to needs. Private capital formation is low compared to neighbors. The export base is narrow. Value added is low. The private sector perceives control of corruption, infrastructure, and education as needs to improving the competitiveness still the case. Further infrastructure and social expenditure increases are needed, financed by a strengthened revenue effort. We're happy that you noticed that there was an increase there in the past. Expenditures need to be more efficient, have a greater impact. The reforming energy sector has yet to achieve wider competition and lower electricity rates. I think there's improvement there too, which I didn't hear you talk about. The reforming energy sector has yet to achieve wider competition and lower electricity rates. I think they have done relatively better, although the rates are still higher than in most surrounding countries. Investment rates are low and governance concerns continue to influence investor confidence. Adding to these constraints are global factors such as slowing growth, a credit squeeze, high oil and food prices and rising inflation. Hence, in the coming years, the Philippines will face significant development challenges. To address the constraints to growth and poverty reduction, the Philippines will need to continue to exercise fiscal discipline and poverty reduction, and further expand its fiscal space. Number two, more widely institute good governance, accelerate infrastructure, education and other social service development, support expansion and diversification of the economic base, and make access to development opportunities more equitable. So, yeah, as I said, a lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same as well. Now, our 2017 validation recommended the following, and you will see again the level to which our recommendations to some extent coincide. For ADB, scale up work in Mindanao. And I would like to hear the audience also about whether that actually worked out in Manila, for ADB. I don't know. Support local government units to enhance their financing capabilities, and we focused on introducing market-based mechanism for LGU financing, notably municipal bonds. Links non-sovereign lending more tightly to CPS objectives like inclusive growth. We had good examples in PPPs. You also have a recommendation whereby you want IFC and World Bank Group programs to coincide, to work together better. ADB should consider establishing a local presence in Mindanao and granting the liaison office a knowledge hub role linked to PIMP EYAGA work. And then we had one on education support should be linked more effectively to social protection. So, did you copy your recommendations from us? And I was looking at your ratings. I had to go to the to the appendix to find out the overall rating, moderately satisfactory. Is that how are you looking at ratings? And I noticed you have a quite clever integration of ratings in the report, but not much mentioning, at least in the main text, of that crucial rating that we have so much trouble with generally in talking with our operational colleagues. So yeah, I was also going through your, let's say, 4 engagement areas and all your sub areas and how you rated. I found 3 moderately unsuccessful ratings, which I just wanted to bring out again, and perhaps that's also interesting. I mean, you seem to mention a lot more areas where there are issues, but you rated low the World Bank's governance and decentralization work of the bank, and the policy development work on improving the investment climate. And the work on better models of infrastructure finance and management, including PPPs, which is an area for IFC. But overall, it was still quite a positive evaluation report. Turning to questions, perhaps I wanted to know a little bit more on how come the World Bank hasn't focused more on infrastructure in the past. ADB, I think, also had a period maybe of a decade or so in which infrastructure was sort of underplayed or deemed less important. But on the ADB side, I think they're ramping up their infrastructure quite drastically, and people can, from the Philippine office can correct me on that, but there are mega projects on railways, and I even recently saw this this project in the pipeline for a bridge across Manila Bay from Bataan to Cavite past Corregidor Island. That'd be like mega, I think. So, but I mean, as I remember, infrastructure. Well, partly because of the previous government's interest, but maybe there was also something to do with the way infrastructure was to be done in the country. I remember with ADB there was a big issue on the safeguards. There was a real transition to strengthening the safeguards, and I remember that ADB in the past had like 7 subsequent transport projects, road projects, and then the 8th, or maybe the 7th, it was the 7th, was no more. DPWH is refusing to ever work again with ADB for various reasons. So there was a period of transition, I think, that was also playing a role. Maybe it was the same for the World Bank. Mm-hmm. And maybe one last point. I mean, you're talking in your reasons for doing the country evaluation in the Philippines, that the Philippines is a dynamic economy transitioning, and lessons can be learned. There's no section on lessons in your report, so we've heard a lot of interesting things, but maybe you can summarize for us the lessons that you learned that would be of interest to other countries in the same situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter. Let's move on right away to the audience. If you have questions, raise your questions. Time is limited for everyone.
Do you have any sections on the sort of new coherence agenda, working with, you mentioned something that between the World Bank and the IFC, but with like ADB and also perhaps like DFAT, the Australia or JICA, you're quite big players, and I didn't hear a lot about other.
Let's take some 3 questions, please.
Sorry, I forgot this.
Hello, I'm Cristina Lozano from the Philippine Country Office. Thank you very much for the presentation. As we all know, the importance of an evaluation is how the findings and recommendations are incorporated later on. We know that there is a new country strategy for the Philippines. If you can elaborate on how the recommendations have been incorporated and how has been reflected into the new strategic thinking. I have a second question on knowledge management. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on the findings regarding the type of knowledge support that the government needs or wants. You mentioned they are not that keen on sector diagnostics as opposed to quick knowledge solutions, but I wonder if you can elaborate on that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristina. One third question here in the back. We'll go for a second round if we are efficient in responding to those questions, right?
Thank you. My name, I am Director's Advisor from the board. I just wanted to complement the first question. Have you compared World Bank's interventions versus other development partners presented in the region? Thank you.
Okay, back to you.
Okay, you can hear me. Thank you very much for the questions. Let me start from the end. The quick answer will be no, because it's not part of our mandate. We are evaluation department of World Bank, so we formally cannot compare World Bank and ADB. Anybody else, you can compare them yourself if you put different evaluations and look at them. It's all public, right? But no, we look at the World Bank program. Of course, it's placed in a country, and it's not only World Bank, it's a government program. It's government projects. There's no such thing as World Bank projects. So in a way, yes, you can compare yourself, but it's not within our mandate. On the knowledge support, yes, what we do recommend, again, the World Bank was a happy recipient, I believe, of quite generous trust funding from bilateral donors, which is not very usual for a middle-income country. And what do economists do when they get funding? They produce reports. And the World Bank is dominated by economists. So we have a lot of high-quality reports. 200 reports over this period. It's quite a remarkable number. And at the central level in Philippines, we all know this is a pretty high capacity environment, right? The people who, by and large, know what they're doing. And in a way, some of the reports were we felt more and more repetitive. Fine, you have this very high quality economic report produced with a bunch of big team and took a year to prepare it. We put it on the table. By that time, it's a very dynamic government. They move ahead. They want to do new things, and they have thousands of projects going on. So a clear demand was to have something smaller, shorter, quicker, more agile. Not necessarily concocted within the World Bank, but something that the government needs today and done tomorrow. So that was the general gist of it. So this is what we suggested our colleagues in the bank office. How the new CPF reflects, that's probably better answered by our bank colleagues, if she wants to respond to that. So what happened is the board discusses the CPE, and then several months later, in this case it was like a month or 2 months later, the board discussed the CPF, the new partnership framework. But we were engaged with the country team, which was very responsive from the conceptual stage, during the evaluation, and at the end, a lot of back and forth. So I would say the CPF itself perhaps is one of the better practice examples of incorporation of lessons and recommendations of the CPE. And this is formally reflected within the CPF document. You can see many references to the evaluation. You can see the formal agreement of the management with all of the recommendations of the report. It's also formalized. There's a matrix there when they agree, disagree, and they say why, and so on. So there's a full agreement with that. It's incorporated. Some things are already happening, so hopefully it added value. The good questions of partnerships. We do have a section on partnerships. There's a section in the report. There's an annex in the report on partnerships where we looked at the cooperation with ADB, with IMF, with JICA and others. So it's there. I just didn't cover it for the sake of a brief presentation. Very quickly, generally, our assessment was quite positive on the cooperation with other partners. So the sort of division of labor is there. Government knows what it wants by and large, who does what. And there's some joint endeavors with different other partners which are generally successful. So there's some little, competition here and there, which is probably normal for a middle-income country environment. On infrastructure, there was a question that I think Walter posed, why the World Bank doesn't lend more on infrastructure. Well, that's a question to be answered by the Philippine government. So I think the World Bank will be happy to lend more on infrastructure. The quick answer that we heard is that, the pricing is offered by others is probably better. And the Philippine government is quite pragmatic in that sense, and you cannot blame for that. So, but it's a big playing field. There's a lot of other issues than infrastructure. So we didn't really dwell on that. We didn't really criticize in this report bank for lack of lending in infrastructure. It's a big field. You have ADB, you have AIIB, you have bilaterals, you have the financial markets. But there are so many other issues. There is the inequality, the poverty, the private sector development agenda, the governance agenda, decentralization. So there's plenty to do for everybody. I hope I answered.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Second round, yes, Veronique.
Okay, Veronique from Independent Evaluation Department. My question is also related to partnership, but more on the side of the synergies and how we can actually leverage that, which is particularly important for upper middle income countries. I just happen to know a little bit in depth the sin tax system and how originally there was also the Asia Foundation that was very much instrumental in making the policy being passed with a political economy approach. And then actually that opened the door for the World Bank to then come in. So that really illustrates how in a context like an upper middle income country, you have different actors having their own comparative advantages, and how can we all articulate all of these comparative advantages and make sure that they're working together, so in coherence, definitely, but more than that, more than in coherence, but really leveraging the benefits, the strengths and weaknesses of each. How is that something that, did you think of that actually? The attribution contribution is always an issue, but how did you address that in your methodology? And how actually, what type of lessons can we draw? And maybe a recommendation that could be really useful for other middle-income countries too.
Thank you, Veronique. Joanne?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My name's Joanne and I work in the evaluation department. And I'm also leading the country program evaluation of Bangladesh, which is coming up. So I'm really interested in the methodology that you used, and perhaps you could tell us more about that. I mean, you said it's about the World Bank's contribution, but I'm kind of interested in, did you ask yourself, like, what difference does the World Bank make, particularly over the long term? And one of the things you said as well is that in relation to the conditional cash transfer, and we know a little bit about that on the ADB side as well, I mean, that's one of the only programs where rigorous impact evaluation has been done. And yet in your recommendation, you're saying that, you know, perhaps you shouldn't stay in an area like this for too long because it becomes a bit dull. But in fact, there is rigorous evidence to show that it has an enormous impact on very poor people's lives, particularly women and children. So presumably the recommendation would be that it needs to continue and it needs to innovate, and it's a program that the government needs to sustain over the longer term. So that's a very complicated question.
John, one more last question?
Hi, good to see you guys again. So it's a little bit related with what Christina mentioned, is we are doing a program for knowledge support through the government here. We'd like to know a little bit more about how you measure the impact, especially of the analytical and the advisory services, which we loosely sometimes call knowledge support. How did you measure that impact? Was there anything you learned about, you know, how this could be improved, and what was the reach, and that, so that we can reflect on your.
Thank you, Vivek. That's it. Back to you then.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to leave the difficult question to Jeff. So just to clarify on CCT, we don't say stop CCT, don't do them. We actually, and you said innovate, that's what they said, innovate, look forward. There is an impact evaluation there, but actually if in the report we have a reference to a study which shows the negative impact of CCTs on the well-being, also a long time. Very interesting study. And we did a project performance evaluation concurrently of this CCT program, which is also already available. So if you're interested in details, it's there. It's a very good report done by another colleague. Yeah, on analytics and methodology. Pass to Jeff. He volunteered.
I should have mentioned, so our CPE methodology at the moment is evolving. Kostya, in many ways, did sort of one of the last CPEs in our old generation model, which was sort of a bottom-up summative approach with ratings. Since our new DG arrived, Alison Evans, we have a mandate to rethink how we're doing these, how we can make them more useful to staff. And so, interestingly, we're just starting a Bangladesh CPE, and there we're asking ourselves, you know, are there horizontal issues that we should look at that perhaps we haven't looked at? We're going to look at the issue of partnerships, I think, a lot more closely, and comparative advantage, which will differ from country to country. I think we fixed the timing issue. You know, this CPE was ready before the CPF was finalized, but if we had done it, say, before it was even started, it might have had larger impact. But we've integrated that. At the moment, we're launching CPEs for Chad, Bangladesh, Ukraine, and Madagascar, and each of them is taking a slightly different methodological approach. In many ways, we're experimenting because our board wants more country-focused work. At the same time, we need to be more streamlined, more relevant, and that means that things may change from country to country. The issue of ratings has now come up. The extent to which these are accountability mechanisms versus learning mechanisms. In many ways, the ratings can draw attention to where, you know, the fact that we mentioned where we had moderately unsatisfactory, they can draw attention to certain areas, but sometimes they can actually divert because you get into big debates. Since we do rate the country programs in the context of the completion learning reviews, that the rating is there. So one of the suggestions is that we don't rate CPEs. There's quite a heated debate internally. You can imagine what that's like. And we're still trying to figure that out. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll actually have a new methodology note for CPEs, which I'm sure we're happy to share broadly.
Analytics, you want?
Oh, analytics. Well, okay, this is everyone's great challenge. We don't have a framework for assessing the quality of analytical products. IFC does. They have something on advisory services, but it's highly specialized. I think a lot of it is going to have to be, talking to producers, talking to the demand side. What's interesting is we just finished a country program evaluation for Albania, and the notion that all analytics should be demand-driven, I think, is refuted in the case of Albania because there were some very, very important issues that initially the government was not interested in. It was pension form, but the bank kept doing analytical work so that when a political window opened, we were ready to hit the ground running. We were informed. I've seen other situations where we weren't maintaining the analytical work because we didn't think that there was an audience for them, there was no demand for them. When there was a political window that opened up, we found ourselves running just to stay in place. So clearly one wants to have value added, but I think that value added needs to be seen in a longer term time frame rather than whether or not it's demanded by the government at that point in time.
Thank you very much. You may want to know that borrowing from the experience of IFC after a year and a half of piloting here, and at the request of the board, we have just launched a system to assess technical assistance here in ADB. It would be the second institution that would have a similar system to more systematically look into the results of technical assistance.
You can come visit us and present it.
Well, we tried it there. At the World Bank, we tried it a lot. We developed the system with IFC, and it was the same thing. Very difficult with other multilaterals around the world, but I'm here now, so we did it here, right? We have put it in place here, right? Thank you very much. Let's put our hands together to thank our presenters and our commentator. Thank you so much for coming at a very last minute here.